Welcome to Module 3 of the Shelter and Settlements training course. This module will look at shelter responses in the humanitarian sector. Click Next to continue.
Hello again. This is the third of 5 training modules on humanitarian shelter and settlements assistance. This session will focus on the shelter side of the sector. Key points to be discussed during this session include the critical importance of framing, why housing should be viewed as a verb and not just a noun, the many options of sheltering people, and shelter isn't really shelter unless it's linked to reducing risks in the home and community.
Let's begin by looking at shelter responses in an emergency. Here's a piece of plastic sheeting that is commonly used for emergency shelter. It comes in rolls 4 meters by 60 meters. In 2013, it cost $365 per roll, plus transportation. Each roll, according to Global Shelter Cluster's recommended standards, depending on the context, can serve 5 families, with each family receiving 2 sheets of 4 meters by 6 meters, along with some ropes and fixings, subject to locally identified needs. What is the difference between this plastic sheeting and the one you find in a regular hardware store? Click the note icon to view the answer. This is not the regular household plastic sheet that you will find in the market, or the one used to cover the back of a truck when it rains. This is what we call shelter-grade plastic sheeting. For it to be this strong, it is also quite heavy. In fact, plastic sheeting standards specify 200 grams per square meter, making each sheet close to 5 kilograms. To the extent possible, humanitarian actors should comply with the minimum sphere standards, including the provision of at least 3.5 square meters of covered living space per person. However, local contexts may constrain compliance with sphere standards. Click the covered living space to learn more. Emergency sheltering options demand few resources from humanitarian agencies, as most of the burden lies on affected communities, which provide most of the required resources. As such, responses should be simple, cost-effective, flexible, and timely to the post-disaster shelter needs. It also requires limited technical assistance, as it mostly relies on locally available resources and know-how. Most technical assistance provided by humanitarian actors to support emergency shelter consist of simple instructions illustrating basic construction and the appropriate use of construction materials, such as plastic sheeting, rope, and other materials distributed. While plastic sheeting has become an internationally accepted standard component for emergency shelter intervention and is stockpiled by many humanitarian agencies around the world, this is rarely the case for framing materials. This is not because framing is any less important than waterproofing. Decisions around framing materials for distribution are heavily dependent on the local context. In some cases, availability of salvageable material negates the need for additional framing material. Some settlements use materials that can be procured locally, such as bamboo and sticks, or some have no access to framing material at all, and it must be procured from different parts of the country for distribution. So framing material could become the wild card when formulating the output for emergency shelter projects. It is important that framing materials must be considered within the context of any given shelter interventions, whether it is bamboo, poles, or even irrigation pipes, as seen here in the photograph. Even if you have assessed and decided that there will be no need for distribution of framing materials, it needs to be justified so that affected communities, donors, and staff in your head offices can understand the situation and needs on the ground. Consider also that framing materials can be reused in the next phase of the recovery process, whether for transitional shelter or as a component of their permanent houses. Framing can serve multiple purposes outside of conventional shelter solutions, but also as a means of promoting disaster risk reduction and safer construction practices. As is commonly known, post-disaster shelter efforts start way before humanitarian actors arrive and are largely community-driven. However, The quality of those early responses varies greatly from disaster to disaster, mainly depending on the disaster-affected household's access to resources and know-how. With few exceptions, post-disaster shelter efforts fail to provide adequate shelter and settlements alternatives to disaster-affected communities and frequently increase exposure to hazards. Click the marker to view an example of how post-disaster shelter efforts vary in their impact. For example, hundreds of households secured good quality emergency and transitional shelters within weeks after the 2009 earthquake in Padang in Indonesia, while in Sudan, displaced households remained in very poor shelters and vulnerable hazards, such as strong winds, for months and even years. The boundaries between emergency and transitional interventions always remain blurry. However, for our purposes, emergency interventions are focused in first-tier shelter life-saving needs, such as health and safety, survival, while transitional interventions are aimed at the second-tier shelter needs, such as comfort, security, protection, and social and cultural appropriateness. As we move from the left to the right of the slide, the resources required to provide each solution increase. More capital, time, labor, and know-how are required to construct transitional shelter than emergency shelter, and even more is required for permanent housing. Thus, households with better access to resources, status, and social connections are often the first to secure permanent shelter post-disaster and bypass or shorten the time spent in emergency and transitional shelters. The post-disaster sheltering process for each household is directly related to the degree of damage to their homes and assets and their ability to access resources. The process is not equal progression for all households, as some may move quickly from emergency shelter to permanent housing, while others may require a longer-term transition to permanence. We touched briefly on USAID and OFDA's approach to shelter and settlements in Module 1. Let's now revisit some key points of the approach before we move forward in this module. The approach emphasizes the use of market-based assessments of damage and need to better gauge impacts, resources, and opportunities in disaster or crisis-affected areas. The core target group of proposed actions will be the most vulnerable amongst affected populations. Provision of support to this group may require technical assistance rather than a reliance on self-help capacity. Where possible and appropriate, our approach should emphasize community-based approaches and reliance on local materials and labor to enhance prospects for sustainability, cost-effectiveness, and livelihood generation. We will now look at different types of humanitarian shelter assistance that is commonly used by the humanitarian community during the emergency phase, such as host families, shelter kits or tents, NFIs, building materials, tools, and training. As mentioned, emergency sheltering options are focused on meeting the most basic or survival shelter needs in the disaster-affected communities. Emergency settlements can be at places of origin, host communities, collective centers, or camps. Faced with displacement, the first preferred sheltering option for most of the affected population will often be friends and relatives living in non-affected areas or houses. Therefore, we must prioritize support to host communities. While this should be encouraged, as it promotes self-recovery and allows us to focus on the more vulnerable families with no options, resources, or connections, it is also important to understand challenges that come with this emergency shelter solution. Click the image to view how host family arrangements can be a concern. Host family arrangements created during the emergency phase, however, can also evolve to become permanent, especially when families are involved. Hosting can make registration difficult and possibly inaccurate, especially if it means displacement into another district or province. If the hosting arrangement is not supported, it can lead to multiple displacements and undermine host families' resilience. For example, elder parents moving into their children's home will unlikely be able to move out afterwards. We will be discussing more options relating to host families and host communities later in the Transitional Shelter Assistance slide. Many families will choose to stay close to their damaged or destroyed homes, putting together a shelter as they are able. This option could be particularly popular in places where land ownership is uncertain, and many families prefer staying close to their land to stake their claim and avoid automatic eviction. Some families may split up, with women and children going off to stay with relatives or collective centers, while the men stay behind to safeguard their plot of land. Or, in situations where the houses have not been washed away, they stay within the vicinity so that salvaging of material from the destroyed homes can start immediately. These salvaged materials are then used for repair work to make the house habitable or for putting together emergency shelter. Emergency shelter assistance in this situation focuses on improving the quality of emergency shelter and these ad hoc repairs by waterproofing and improving secured fixings through distribution of tents or shelter kits. Household shelter kits are commonly composed of plastic sheeting, rope and fixings such as nails, screws, and washers. Community tool kits can also be distributed where assessments have shown a need. These are often distributed per 5 families so that tools can be shared amongst the families, ensuring a wider coverage and more effective use of resources. In cases where framing structures cannot be salvaged or obtained locally, additional poles may be included into the shelter kit. Lastly, but perhaps most importantly, emergency shelter assistance must contribute towards providing technical assistance to ensure better and safer construction practices are promoted and used to ensure effective use of materials provided and prolong the life of plastic sheeting. This can be done through a demonstration shelter in the community, trainings, orientation, or at the very least, information campaign. Click the note icon to know why tents make poor emergency shelters. Tents often make poor emergency shelters since they are more expensive, less flexible, and too small to accommodate disaster-affected households when compared to other sheltering options. Maintenance of tents and prefabricated structure could be difficult for local populations. Furthermore, anecdotal evidence collected by USAID OFDA during several humanitarian responses indicates that tents are rarely a priority to disaster-affected households. Overwhelmingly, the disaster-affected populations prefer alternatives to tents, such as to stay with host families or stay in damaged and undamaged public buildings or collective centers. Thus, the deployment of tents and/or prefabricated structures should not be considered as a default response, but only to be deployed after a field-based assessment determined that no other shelter resources are available in affected areas, that affected populations are willing to accept tents or prefabricated structures, and sufficient resources are available to support purchase and deployment costs. Tents and/or prefabs, if used, must be accompanied by a longer-term plan. By definition, collective centers are existing buildings used to host displaced populations. These buildings are almost always constructed prior to the displacement and were not designed to accommodate displaced populations. Collective centers, as well as camps, should be considered as a last resort when securing housing for displaced populations. In many settlements, the only safe buildings still standing after disasters are public buildings such as schools, temples, mosques, churches, or government buildings. Often these buildings have also doubled as gathering places for the community during non-disaster times. In many communities, it is included as part of their contingency plan. While this reduces the urgency of immediate shelter provision, ensuring that these buildings provide adequate and dignified dwelling is often a challenge, whether from overcrowding, lack of privacy, or inadequate infrastructure. Prolonged stay will also delay communities' recovery, as the buildings cannot be returned to its original use and schools could not be reopened. Residents of collective centers will have to be relocated, which is costly, can be challenging. Protection issues are also a concern in collective centers. Collective centers should only be used as a last resort. Click the marker to see key shelter items within collective centers that can be included. Key shelter assistance within collective centers can include essential household non-food items, especially beddings and blankets, storage boxes, as well as material for making partitions. It is also worth checking cooking arrangements within the collective centers to understand the need for cooking utensils. Note that additional support may be required as part of a return package during voluntary return or as an incentive for return to place of origin as the collective center moves towards closure. Disaster-affected households move to largely unaffected areas where they set up self-constructed structures using locally available materials. As soon as they are created, indigenous formal and informal leaderships often engage in the management of those settlements. Unfortunately, the management capacity and the resources available are limited, making spontaneous settlements commonly ill-suited to accommodate the displaced. Spontaneous settlements are characterized by unsanitary conditions, exposing their inhabitants to the easy spread of diseases, poorly located, making them vulnerable to hazards such as landslides, floods, insecurity that threaten the welfare of the displaced population, and lack basic services such as education, health, water and sanitation, and poor access to livelihoods. Humanitarian actors upgrade these spontaneous settlements early in the intervention, with shelter solution generally conforming to shelter kits or tents. Unfortunately, the provision of assistance in camp settings will likely create incentives for displaced households to remain and attract those from outside, prolonging the camp's lives beyond necessity. From experience, camps can delay the recovery process and can itself become an inadequate long-term settlement. Click the marker to view an example on why camps must be the last resort. For example, roughly 400,000 people remained in camps throughout Port-au-Prince more than 2 years after the 2010 earthquake. Greater emphasis should have been placed on rapidly reintegrating camp residents back to their original neighborhoods. This large camp population could have been reduced dramatically through greater emphasis on non-camp shelter options. This experience serves as a lesson for future humanitarian responses, particularly in urban areas, and underscores the importance of viewing camps as a last resort rather than a default response. Both communities and humanitarian actors often allocate considerably more resources to support creation and upgrade of transitional shelter solutions. The focus of transitional assistance can vary, but they all aim to bridge the gap between humanitarian emergency shelter and permanent housing, while increasing comfort, security, protection, social, and cultural appropriateness. It can take the form of a host family and host community support, housing repairs, or provision of transitional shelter. The delivery of transitional assistance can be tailored to community needs. It is important to understand the context and design of a program that not only provides shelter but also contributes to the social and economic recovery of settlements. As discussed in the previous section, hosting is an early coping mechanism for displaced populations. Hosting arrangements can and will occur independently of humanitarian assistance and usually start out as an emergency-only measure. The hosting arrangement could be socially defined based on family, friends, and neighbors. This arrangement can often be carried out with little or no external support during the emergency, though additional assistance will likely be required for longer periods of hosting. Economically defined, hosting is often among strangers and can come in the form of market-based rental that is negotiated by the families involved. Both of these arrangements can start with turning a spare storage room or family living room into accommodation for the displaced family. This can later be upgraded into an extension of a house or construction of a separate unit. In Haiti, it was found that 70% of over 26,000 hosting arrangements supported by OFDA and NGOs evolved into permanent housing solutions. That's over 18,500 families that didn't need permanent housing, didn't get in a queue for transitional shelter repair program, and didn't end up in a camp. This is very substantial. This is a very effective way of sheltering people. Support to host family and host community can take many forms depending on the need of both host and hosted families. Sometimes this is livelihood support, cash grants, or vouchers for rent support, school fees, fuel, and other additional expenses. Sometimes the need is for shelter or additional latrines, and sometimes it's agricultural inputs so they can better integrate into a local economy. Typically, the humanitarian community will decide upon a notional package of need-based assistance, assign a cost to total package, and apply the support package and cost on an as-needed basis rather than a one-size-fits-all. We should assist these displaced families to stay being hosted for as long as we can while we try to find durable solutions for them. These can involve returning to place of origin, upgrading the current hosting arrangement into a more durable shelter solution, or it could mean a relocation to a different location entirely. Click the marker to view what kind of support may be required by host communities. As a community, influx of displaced population can have a large impact on the hosting community, increasing demands on schools and healthcare, as well as other public facilities and infrastructures. So the support to host communities can take the form of repair and expansion of schools, markets, health facilities, water systems, and so on. In 2010, an NGO implemented a hosting intervention for the earthquake-affected population in Cap Haitien in the north of Haiti, where no damage from the earthquake had been reported. The program supported 550 affected families who had migrated from Port-au-Prince to stay with friends and families in Cap Haitien. The program provided school vouchers, small grants for businesses, as well as packages of building materials for home improvement, construction of additional latrines, or transitional shelter. Each hosting arrangement was targeted for an average of $800 of humanitarian assistance for the period of 3 months. A year after the program had ended, 87% of those arrangements were still going on. So for $800, we managed to effectively keep these families from moving into camps for 15 months. They are now more likely to return to their neighborhood or stay on at their place of hosting. In the 15 months after the earthquake, they have enjoyed better protection and better quality of life compared to those who had taken up residence in one of the many camps in and around Port-au-Prince. The support was simply to extend what they were already doing, capitalizing on their coping mechanism, which in turn made the support very cost-effective. Typically, only a portion of the affected housing stocks are damaged or destroyed. Emergency shelter kits can contribute to initial repair efforts, though more substantial repairs may be required as we move into transition. Understanding the nature of damage will be key to determining the common denominator of repair needs, for by this time, everyone's need will be different and there is no one solution fits all. Technical assessments should be carried out prior to and during the implementation of this program. The Repair and Retrofit program has the capacity to quickly reduce the number of displaced populations, act as an incentive for returns to place of origin, improve the quality and safety of existing shelters, and it could be what is needed to kickstart overall recovery effort. Shelters constructed during the transition phase have been called many things. It can be transitional shelter, early recovery shelter, core shelter, one-room shelter, or even progressive shelter. It can also have different underlying philosophy. Some are designed to be expanded and upgraded into larger, more permanent housing, while others are designed so that components and framing structures can be dismantled and reused in the construction of a permanent house. What they have in common is the attempt to bridge the gap between emergency shelter, which focuses on life-saving, and permanent housing. They are seen as a stepping stone towards return to normalcy, providing more comfort, security, protection, as well as being more socially and culturally appropriate than the emergency shelter. The transitional shelters provide opportunities to incorporate DRR measures and linkages to other key sectors. Transitional shelter support can come in the form of cash grants, material package, material vouchers, technical trainings, or all of the above. It can also include setting up a prefabrication factory for key elements, which includes the hiring of local laborers, or it can be a combination of the above. Humanitarian agencies will likely design the shelter intervention in such a way that it requires active input from the affected families. For example, a transitional shelter program may only provide key structural elements like footings, frames, and roofing, requiring families to contribute towards wall cladding or reuse the plastic sheeting previously provided. Click each image to learn more about each case study. These transitional shelters were built in 1906 after the San Francisco earthquake and were called earthquake shacks. This was long before the time of site planning standards and fire safety promotion, and the shelters were put right next to each other. But what is important here is that these shelters are still around. They have been moved, reprogrammed, adapted, and adopted as needed. There are still about 80 of these shelters left in San Francisco over 100 years later. The current market value of these shelters is approximately $800,000 each. So while you design something that is meant to be temporary and transitional, the likelihood of these shelters being used for much longer than their intended lifespan is very high. Here we have another example from Port-au-Prince. The lack of space was a very big obstacle for agencies working in shelter in the urban areas. In order to achieve minimum required covered living space that we discussed in Module 1, one possible option was to provide two-story transitional shelters. Many agencies were experimenting with this idea in Haiti. The two-story shelter in the photograph cost about $3,000, was designed to be both earthquake and wind resistant, and has survived both Hurricanes Sandy and Isaac intact. Though these units were designed to accommodate 2 family units, they can also be used to support one large family of more than 5 or 6 people. The upgrading process will be a natural step for most families. It will be carried out incrementally as and when resources become available. Transitional shelter programs thus should be designed to facilitate upgrading to permanence through reliance upon beneficiary capacities and resources, local labor and material markets, external financial assistance, promotion of safer building practices. Remember, permanent housing reconstruction is beyond the mandate of USAID and OFDA. Most humanitarian actors do not engage in permanent housing reconstruction because it's beyond their mandate, protocols, and capacities. Before we move on, let's have a look at some key lessons learned through years of providing humanitarian shelter assistance. Click each image for the key lessons. Shelter is always linked to land, which is always loaded with multiple issues. Home ownership is often not the same as land ownership. Squatters and renters often have no claim to land security and are most likely to be displaced for prolonged periods. Households with no land security can also face risks of eviction by landowners after shelter assistance is provided. While humanitarian actors are unlikely to solve long-term land tenure issues, they should ensure that some form of land occupation agreement is part of the shelter assistance. Land is often linked to hazards, which may require monitoring. Increased urbanization has forced people to settle on lands previously considered uninhabitable. In many cases, these lands are subjected to disasters, the risk of which is worsened by increased construction and destruction of natural resources. Understanding of risks faced by the settlements is key in providing appropriate assistance that will not further harm their chance of survival. Shelter isn't really shelter unless it is linked to disaster risk reduction. By now, this should not have come as a surprise. Shelter programs will always need to come with DRR components, regardless of the type of support.
Key points to remember from Session 3 include USAID OFDA doesn't engage in permanent housing reconstruction mainly because those needs are well beyond our mandate and the mandate's protocols, expertise, and institutional memories of most humanitarian actors. Shelter, particularly forms of transitional shelter, can jumpstart and re-engage affected populations in the incremental, longer-term process of housing development that exists in most countries. Shelter is also a means of promoting disaster risk reduction and livelihoods, and the platform for other sector interventions. And, unlike other sectors, there is no easy handoff from shelter assistance to permanent housing reconstruction. With this programmatic vacuum, it's all the more reason to emphasize context and transition. Let's move on to Session 4.